Hello, on the 29th of April 1992, Valentin Essegragbo Melvin Stresser accidentally seized power in Leone, a small diamond-rich country in the western part of Africa, becoming the world's youngest head of state, leading 4 million people and the commander-in-chief of a fractious, impoverished army. The story of Stresser is unusual, even by experience of West African dictatorships. His unlikely rise to power and his precipitous fall to poverty is one of the best explanations of a tale of rags to riches to rags. Valentin Essegragbo Melvin Stresser was born on April 26, 1967 in Freetown, Leone, where he attended Church Missionary Society Grammar School up to Form 6 at a post-secondary level. On completing school, he enlisted in the Republic of Leone military forces, where he rose to a rank of a junior officer after his training. Stresser was an unknown army captain and only came close to fame when he won a couple of dance-offs in a nightclub in Allentown, a Freetown slum. On the 29th of April 1992, Stresser was among the 6 disgruntled junior military officers who seized power in a bloodless coup and overthrew the then president Joseph Saidu Momo, who was nicknamed Dandong, meaning idiot, for his bad leadership. Taking power was the easiest of tasks, but keeping it and running the country would be the toughest jobs Stresser and his colleagues would have to face. The thought of toppling Saidu's government came about as a result of more than 2 decades of corruption and mismanagement of the country. Life in Leone had become harder due to a war in neighboring Liberia that had spilled over in the country. Stresser started his military career in 1990 as a regional peacekeeper in Liberia under the Economic Community of West African Monitoring Group, where he served for 7 months. On his return from Liberia, he joined a unit fighting the rebel incursion in the east that had crossed over from Liberia under Charles Taylor. Stresser and a group of other government soldiers had to endure miserable fighting conditions, lack of logistical support, and limited ammunition. Ironically, the soldiers at the war front sometimes did not even receive their salaries on time, and their welfare was hardly at the top of the government's list of priorities. During his first interview as president, Stresser described how he had to fight the Revolutionary United Front rebels with absolute guns that wouldn't fire. On the 1st of May 1981, he received a shrapnel wound to the leg while defending a bridge and endured an operation without anesthetic due to lack of medical supplies. To make matters worse, the military refused to send Stresser and other injured soldiers an ambulance or helicopter for evacuation from the battlefield for further treatment, claiming the country couldn't afford it. The seeds of discontent had been sowed amongst the soldiers, and so, on the 29th of April 1992, Stresser and colleagues launched Operation Daybreak, drove to the capital Freetown to make their grievances known. They ended up raiding the office of the president in central Freetown, as well as a lavish old presidential lodge, where they found President Momo hiding in the bathroom wearing a dressing gown. He was bundled into an army helicopter and taken over to the border in Guinea. If the coup had come as a shock to Momo, the young officers seemed equally surprised at the ease of their takeover. Later, it would transpire that although the officers were planning a coup, they hadn't necessarily meant to do so on that day. Fate had simply handed them a chance. The coup leaders were so unprepared that they hadn't designated a new leader. Eventually, Stresser was chosen for 3 reasons, not because of his leadership or military expertise, but simply because he was one of the few who had completed secondary school and his English was good enough to read the junta's declaration on radio. As captain, he was also of a higher rank than his co-conspirators. Some also argued that Stresser got at the top post because those around him felt that he could be manipulated easily. The new rulers of Leone called themselves the National Provisional Ruling Council, NPRC, with Stresser as chairman and president at the youthful age of 25. In standard coup fashion, Stresser denounced nepotism, tribalism, corruption, and promised a clean-up exercise. His government was highly welcomed and popular, whereby people were even snapping up calendars decorated with Stresa, our Redeemer. In no time, the Redeemer introduced reforms by endorsing a 2-year transition to democracy. The soldiers launched a clean-up campaign to rid the streets of mountains of garbage, and often joining in themselves. The economy was doing so well that gas and electricity were once again available. Ambulances, which had all but disappeared from Freetown, were imported and put back to use again. Freetown was painted with inspirational slogans and national heroes. Street crime was reduced. Inflation was lowered from 115 annually to less than 15%. Surely Stresa was in control, and for a while he proved his critics wrong that had judged him according to his age. However, after a brief period, the euphoria faded. 8 months in, Stresa made the worst blunder of his presidency that would later haunt him long after he had left power. He executed 29 innocent civilians by firing squad on a beach outside Freetown for a foiled attempted coup in December 1992. Some of the men at the time of the coup plotting were even in prison. Realizing his mistake, Stresa apologized and declared nationwide period of mourning. In addition, Stresa promoted himself and his colleagues in the army ranks, which sowed confusion and resentment in the army. This meant that junior officers were suddenly giving their ranking spurious orders. At the time, Sierra Leoneans joked darkly that the NPRC, the interim government's acronym, stood for Na Pikin Run Country, meaning the children are running the country. Some officers moved into lavish houses they had seized from the previous administration's corrupt officials, where they partied hard. Stresa made Valentine's Day a national celebration, along with Bob Marley's birthday. And at one point, he sought to make the disco classic Ain't No Stopping Us Now the national anthem. The junta favored pale-skinned women, creating a craze for bleaching among girls in Freetown. Women who tried to lighten their skin tone with chemicals were called the Wanchi girls. Stresa and his colleagues began to engage in their own scams like their predecessors and tried to muscle in on the diamond trade. In October 1993, Stresa and his officers engaged in smuggling diamonds. This was revealed by a Swedish newspaper suggesting that they had flown to Antwerp, Europe's diamond capital, with smuggled stones valued at tens of millions of dollars. They used the money earned from the deal to buy arms and divided the rest amongst themselves. The managing editor and 6 other colleagues who published the article were arrested and thrown in prison. By late 1993, Stresa's handling of the Bluing War in the East made matters worse for him. His army was close to defeating the rebels when Stresa called for a ceasefire in December, which turned out to be a huge blunder that enabled the RUF rebels to regroup and begin setting up jungle bases around the country. They became a nightmare to Stresa and his government that he was rapidly losing control over a big chunk of the country. In desperate attempts, the government launched an army recruitment drive enlisting children as young as 12, which increased the army ranks from 5,000 in 1991 to 12,000 in 1994. However, that did little to help save Stresa and his men. By the following January, state radio bulletins were urging citizens to have sticks, stones and machetes ready, as refugees pouring into the capital Freetown brought tales of torture and mutilation from the east. In a last-ditch effort to save his regime, Stresa solicited the help of mercenaries, which at first included the Gulukas security guards and later turned to executive outcomes, who composed predominantly of former South African Special Forces troops, whose role was to combat the rebels, and payment would be made in diamond concessions and cash. The move was a triumph, whereby the war was stopped and rebels had to retreat. Fighting in Sierra Leone ceased, and over 1 million displaced people returned to their homes. But this came at a huge cost of $35 million, just 1/3 of the government's annual defense budget. The period of peace was short-lived, as the mercenaries that the government relied on had to leave, due to a provision within the Abidjan Peace Accord of 1996, where all foreign troops had to leave Sierra Leone. With the accord receiving overwhelming international support, Stresa was under intense pressure to let go of the mercenaries in order to ensure peace. This too turned out to be a great relief for the RUF rebels, who weren't disarmed and decided to regroup and started attacking again. Under pressure from the civic organizations and the donor community, Stresa decided to hold polls in February 1996 and put himself forward as a candidate, ignoring the constitutional minimum age of 90. He subsequently threatened to fire his colleagues who did support him, which inflamed existing leadership rifts within the party. A few weeks before the election, Stresa went to a routine government meeting with substantial security personnel. While in the meeting, his second-in-command, Julius Maada Bio, held a gun to his head and ordered him to surrender. He was overpowered and bundled into a helicopter and flown to Guinea, just as it had happened to Joseph Momo 4 years earlier. On their way to exile, the captors were too sloppy that they realized the keys to the handcuffs were forgotten. The chopper had to fly back to Freetown to retrieve them. Though Maada Bio was only 30 at the time and harbored ambitions to make himself president, he allowed the election campaign to proceed, and in March 1996, Ahmed Tijan Kaba, a 64-year-old politician, was elected as president. What happened to Stresa after being deposed is perhaps the strangest in Stresa's unusual life, as well as the biggest lesson to all African leaders. The international community negotiated with the NPRC over the reintroduction of civilian rule, and one of the incentives offered to the members of the junta in return to relinquishing power was the opportunity to study in the West. Even though Stresa had eventually lost power by less graceful means, he was able to take up this opportunity. He was admitted to the University of Warwick in England. The university's decision to consider admitting him was controversial, however. There was a ferocious internal row whether he should be allowed to enter as a student, despite assurances from reputable sources to the university that Stresa was not responsible for human rights violations. Suffice to say, his presence didn't go down well among the student body at the university, which included several students in exile from Sierra Leone. The most renowned incident is when a fellow student, whose relative was among those executed on the beach, launched a campaign to have him ejected. With the pressure mounting, UN declined to renew his funding after it expired at the end of the year. Hard pressed, Stresa dropped out 18 months into his law studies. The media also made his life miserable when they ran headlines like "The Butcher of Sierra Leone Drawing the Doll" in the Times newspaper. He was also forced to abandon his council flat in North London Borough of Islington after the Independent newspaper tracked down his address in 1999. By November 2000, Stresa sought to escape by fleeing to Banjul, the capital of Gambia, but there he met more of the same. He was beaten up at a nightclub by relatives of some of the innocent people executed at the beach in 1992. Things turned sour when the Gambian authorities accused him of fomenting another coup. He was arrested and deported back to London, where he was refused re-entry. At this point, there was nowhere left to go, especially when many others had despised and rejected him. The then President Ahmed Tijan Kaba granted him amnesty to return home. He was given some dignity to feel human again on his return home, only for him to return to a depressed and destitute state when the Kaba government was swept out of power through the justice of the ballot rather than the power of the bullet. Today, he lives with his mother and spends days drinking gin by the roadside. And for Julius Maada Bio, who deposed Stresa, he was elected president of Sierra Leone in a runoff election held on the 31st of March 2018. Thank you for watching and subscribe for more videos.